Yo, what's up? Columbina just had her version 5 update, which should be the finalized version of her kit since they added her birthday. So let's go over everything you need to know about how to build and play Columbina and where her strength sits in the overall meta. Starting off, if you don't already know what Columbina does, Columbina is the newest 5-star Hydro Catalyst coming next patch. She can apply Hydro with her elemental skill with a 100% uptime and deal direct lunar damage of all 3 types of lunar reactions: Lunar Charge, Lunar Bloom, and Lunar Crystallize. She also is going to be a great buffer for the Nodcry teams and Zibai, the newest moon sign character, who does lunar crystallize damage. Columbina has a great lunar damage bonus buff on her elemental burst, which is team-wide, so you can give your DPS, sub-DPS, and Columbina herself a solid increase. Columbina is a great mix of a sub-DPS and a buffer, and is a great increase to the current best teams. In this video, I'll go over how to play and build Columbina and what you should expect from her on release. So let's get started. But first, a word from our sponsor. If you play Genshin like I do, you already know how fast top-ups add up. Welkins, Genesis Crystals, Battle Passes, all of it starts to get expensive. LootBar lets you buy Genshin top-ups at a discounted price, so you spend less for the same Primo Gems. You log in, pick your pack, and the crystals go straight into your account. I use LootBar because I'm already spending anyway. This helps me save money every month while still pulling for new characters and weapons. If you want cheaper top-ups, use my LootBar link below and start saving on your Genesis purchases. Make sure you spend responsibly, and if you are struggling with addiction, call 1-800-522-4700. Okay, now back to the video. Okay, so I want to start by talking about weapons, but before we do that, we need to preface it by laying the groundwork for what weapon she's going to want to use. So what do I mean by that? When we take a look at her elemental burst, this is something you typically want to use every single rotation. It's only got a 2-second duration, and it has a very nice buff like we just mentioned, so it's not going to really increase your rotation times. But here is the problem. Taking a look, it has a 60 energy cost, and taking a look at her elemental skill, you can see here, the energy generation is spread out through the duration of the skill rather than dropping a bunch of particles that she could pick up. So this will make it so that she will not be actually collecting the hydro particles that she generates, meaning that it's going to go to the on-fielder rather than her, meaning it's going to increase her ER requirements. So knowing how she generates particles, figuring out how many particles she generates, and the amount of particles the team will collect, because she will never collect any, we now need to be able to figure out what energy recharge needs she has. So specifically taking a look at the Flins team, we can see here that she will generate energy once every 2 hits, so once every 4 seconds, because each attack of the continuous elemental skill damage hits every 2 seconds, so once every 4 seconds, she has a 66% chance to generate 1 particle, and then a 1/3 to generate 2 particles. Since Flins' team's rotation are typically 17 seconds, this means that she'll have 4 opportunities to generate particles. Then, statistically speaking, one of those should be a 2-particle drop. So on average, you're going to get around 5.3 particles each time you're doing a rotation with Columbina in the Flins team. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about the other sources of energy that you get. We're going to go over them real quick. First off, you got Electro Resonance, which you get a particle every 5 seconds. That's 3 more particles. You have Flins generating a particle every 2 seconds. And then he has a 10-second duration, meaning you're going to generate around 5 particles. Then Ineffa. Ineffa is going to be dealing a hit once every 2 seconds for 16 seconds, meaning it's 8 hits. Then she has a 66% chance to generate a single electro particle on each hit. This is going to put her energy regen similar to what Columbina is at 5.3 particles per rotation. So now that we've taken that all into account, you can see here we're getting around 5.3 hydro particles with 17.3 non-hydro particles, and I'm going to assume Columbina's not going to catch any of these here because she's going to be going in typically earlier on the rotation and then not swapping in until the end of rotation. With this knowledge, we can actually start plugging in different types of weapons to help meet her ER needs and get a good idea of how much energy recharge she's going to need from her substats and the roll amounts that you're going to want. Okay, starting off, let's talk about a weapon that's not going to give you any energy recharge at all. So anything that you can imagine. Let's take a look here at what the energy recharge requirements would be. So you're going to catch none of the particles, getting 5.3 to hydro, and then 17.3 non-elemental particles to your element. This will result in you needing around 313% to 318% energy recharge. This is a very, very high cost, and the amount of energy recharge you will need will bite into the other stats. You can see here, you're going to need 29 to 30 average rolls. Then if you are running SMS, 26 to 27 average rolls. So you really want to run a weapon to help you minimize these ER requirements. So from here on out, when I talk about the weapon section, I am only going to really talk about weapons that will help with your ER requirements. So let's get started with the first weapon, Prototype Amber. Okay, so Prototype Amber has 3 really amazing things going for it. The first thing being the HP substat. Columbina very much so likes the HP from this, so that's a benefit already. The second thing, and probably the most important thing, is the flat energy refund that is given from using your elemental burst. You're given 18 energy, so this takes the elemental burst cost from 60 all the way down to 42. That alone is already tremendously good, but the last thing that's the icing on the cake, the cherry on top, is the ability to heal your teammates after using an elemental burst. Typically, she's played in teams that don't have a healing sustain unit. Flins doesn't have a sustain unit, Nefer doesn't have one, and then Zibai also is lacking a sustain unit as well, since she's only doing shielding stuff. So this weapon, in my opinion, is the most recommendable free-to-play option. If you are going to pull Columbina, this would probably be your go-to weapon. Looking at the damage of this weapon, it's actually pretty good. You can see here I have it around 17.4k. This was the baseline option I chose comparing to the other weapons, and you'll see why shortly. Overall, this is the most recommendable option, and for free-to-plays and probably for most people, if you don't have the signature weapon, this would be what I recommend. Next, let's talk about Favonius Codex. So, specifically for Favonius Codex, you would assume that this could be a semi-decent option considering the amount of energy you're going to need for Columbina since it seems pretty taxing, but I found in my testings that it doesn't really feel like it's that good comparatively to Prototype Amber. So the main thing that we really need to point out is when you are on field and you catch a particle, you gain more for that particle than when you are off field. So because of that, and since Columbina isn't ever going to be catching her particles, the value of energy recharge gets reduced in comparatively to something like a flat energy buff like we talked about with Prototype Amber. So that is kind of reducing Codex's viability. Here I have a calc showcasing the energy requirement needs if you don't actually catch the Favonius proc, and let's say you proc Favonius as you're swapping out into ineffa to keep your rotation similar. This is around 15k damage. It's not bad, but comparatively, it's just worse off than the Prototype Amber. Then I have a single Favonius Codex with a caught. This means that you proc the Favonius Codex at the very start as soon as you go into Columbina and you actually manage to catch the particles when you are using your elemental burst. Then you can swap to your next character and hopefully the energy will have stayed on Columbina and she'll caught the particles. This one is like 1k DPS better. This one's damage is technically changed because of the amount of crit rolls I gave it to accommodate for the possibility of catching the white particles, so that's why this deals around 1k more damage. Overall though, it's still not better than the Prototype Amber, so I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, next let's talk about the possibility of running 2 Favonius Codexes. This one is a little bit more sus. I wouldn't recommend this one. This one you're going to have to gimp another one of your characters, like give Sucrose Fav rather than having her whole TTDS, which I don't recommend, but this allows you to essentially run a HP timepiece on Columbina, then you get more benefit from having more substats. So this one's dealing around 18.6k. Overall, it's not bad, but you are losing team DPS from other methods, so overall, don't recommend. Okay, let's talk about the signature weapon. This one's pretty interesting. The signature weapon here, I actually have over the baseline by around 30%, which makes sense. Typically, signature weapons are pretty much better than the baseline weapon from 30% onwards, so this is a pretty typical weapon. The fact that it gives flat energy gives it the same type of benefit as the Prototype Amber, even though it does give a little bit less, but the amount of stats that it gives in change, like the crit value and the HP percent, makes up for the fact that it doesn't give as much energy. So overall, this is a great weapon. The main caveat though is that getting this weapon, you lose the HP healing from Prototype Amber, so if you really think it's better, you can. It is going to be a damage increase, but another thing that we'll get into later on in the team section, Columbina isn't really dealing a lot of damage in these teams. I have her only dealing 2.5 of these Moonwheel procs, making it so her personal damage contribution is really low inside of her teams. It's not as high as it was in the earlier calcs or the earlier estimates, so keep that in mind. Increasing her personal damage versus having more utility, I would say having more utility is overall better. Next, I wanted to add Etherlight Spindlelute. This is actually the 6.0 free-to-play catalyst. Typically, you would run this on someone like Lauma, but I wanted to test how good it would be on Columbina. It's actually not bad. It's somewhere in between the Favonius Codex where you catch the particles and where you don't catch the particles. I have it around 15.5k DPS. overall, it's not a bad option, but you should just run Prototype Amber. It's just better. So keep that in mind. Next, let's talk about the Battle Pass weapons. I want to talk about Sac Jade at R1 and at R5. Starting with R1, this weapon is, like I said before, problematic because it doesn't give any energy recharge, meaning your energy recharge requirements are going to be in the 300s, and to accommodate for that, you have to lose a lot of substats. I'm using KQM standards to assume substats, so I basically had to remove all of the crit value that I was giving to these characters in order to make up for the fact that that value stat would have to go into energy recharge instead. So you can see here, I have Sac Jade at around a little bit less than 15k, and then Sac Jade at R5 is a little bit worse than the Prototype Amber, but this one can vary considering the amount of substats required go over KQM standard, so this one is a little bit iffy. Overall though, I would still say it's probably worse off than the Prototype Amber, so keep that in mind. It's a good weapon, but you're going to need to build a lot of ER when you could just run Prototype Amber and have an easier time anyway. So that's all for the weapon section. There's not really many other weapons here that I wanted to mention. Typically, most of the weapons here are kind of the same concept as if you have no energy refund, you're going to have to build 300 ER, so it's going to gimp the weapon's damage and gimp Columbina's damage, so keep that in mind. You typically want to run an energy refunding weapon. So now that we've talked about the weapons, let's get into the next section. Starting off, let's talk about the Silken Moon Serenade, since I believe this to be the default best in slot option in the majority of teams. Since we discussed earlier how Columbina has a semi-major ER problem since she doesn't funnel, the 20% ER from the 2-piece helps us allocate into more stats for her through the subs rather than having to accommodate and build more ER in the subs instead. Typically, in the majority of teams, you're going to want to run SMS anyway on at least one of your characters when you're using Moonsign, so putting it on Columbina where it has a perfect 2-piece synergy, and the buffing 4-piece makes it a competitive option in not just damage, but also comfortability. This set is typically what I'd recommend as an overall set for your Columbina, and it was my standard for investment and should be regarded as such. Next, let's talk about the brand new set, Obeyed of the Morningstar and Moon. This set is the brand new sub DPS set releasing in patch 6.3, giving 80 EM from the 2-piece and 60% lunar reaction damage to an off-fielder. It's a solid competitor to SMS for Columbina, emphasizing her personal damage rather than buffing utility. This set has a varying amounts of damage depending on the team it's being ran in. Since Columbina's Moon Gravity procs is once every 6 seconds, it means her damage is being cut in teams under 18 seconds, and since the third hit happens right when I assume the rotation ends, to accommodate for this, I assume 2.5 hits in the rotation sub 18 seconds, and the full amount in rotations above 18 seconds. The reason this is relevant is because cutting the personal damage from Columbina lowers the direct value of this set, and it's only buffing the personal damage. Because of that, its performance varies depending on teams. Overall, it's not a bad option considering its buff is fairly strong, but this set is more recommendable for a dedicated sub DPS in the team like Ineffa for Flins. But in teams where Columbina acts as a sub DPS, like in the Zibai teams, it garnishes way more value. In Nefer specifically, you'd think it could have some value, but because a lot of the damage coming from Columbina and Nefer is actually Llama's Quills, Llama is essentially the sub DPS here, but she's putting her damage into the other two characters, knowing that putting Llama on a 2-piece EM and Columbina on the SMS set actually nets you more value for your team and outdoes running Morningstar. In Zibai's case, since the other two options in the team are strictly buffers and run support sets, you can run Morningstar here for the best value. Next, let's talk about a more niche supportive set, Tenacity of Neuvillette. Tenacity is a very solid option, but only inside of the Flins team and Columbina and Nefa wheelchair core. The general rule of thumb is that if a Nefa and Columbina deal competitive damage to your on-fielder, then run personal damage buffing sets, SMS and Star. But if your main DPS is dealing a large and significant amount of the team DPS, you can run Columbina on Tenacity and buff both Ineffa and the attack ceiling DPS. I put less emphasis on Columbina's personal damage. Typically, this is recommendable depending on the investment level of your DPS. Realistically speaking, this only applies to someone like Flins or Mavuika inside of their respective variants. Overall though, Tenacity of Neuvillette could be a potentially powerful set and heavily depends on the investment of your main carry and the rest of your team. Okay, now let's mention some more niche sets since they're worth mentioning. Starting off with DeepWood, typically this set is only used inside of Nefer Llama or Hyperboom Columbina Llama DPS teams. It's a decent option, but it's more preferable to the 4th slot, typically whether it's Nahida for Nefer or a Hyperboom trigger or another slot altogether, since it doesn't really benefit Columbina at all. Then, for Night Sky Unveiling, this can be a solid option for DPS Columbina in these Hyperbloom teams, and I wouldn't really recommend running Columbina as a DPS, but its teams are semi-strong. Overall, it's not a bad option. Okay, now that we've gotten artifacts out of the way, let's talk about the team section and where she can slot into. Starting off, let's talk about the biggest winners of Columbina, being Flins, Nefer, and also now Zibai. Zibai we'll talk more on in a dedicated video for her since she's also a new unit, but let's start off by talking about Flins. So, let's compare Flynn's best in slot team pre 6.3 with his new best in slot team post 6.3. So firstly, when we talk about Columbina for Flins, we need to start off with why it's such a drastic change for Flynn's DPS, jumping from the 4th to arguably the 1st or 2nd best DPS in the game alongside Nefer and Zibai. The main hole inside of Flynn's team previously was the Hydra slot. This concept will also apply to the Nefer teams, so the same argument can be made there, but for time's sake, I'm only going to say it in this portion. The main thing holding back Flynn's was the Hydra slot inside of the lunar reaction teams was typically anti-synergistic. The fact that the lunar reaction and direct lunar damage don't scale at all with damage bonus hurts a lot of the current best Hydra players like Farina or Yalan. Because of that, the buffing utility they have in their kit is typically useless for these lunar teams. A great example of this is when Nefer was in her pre-release state, I talked about running Xingqiu or Farina, but strictly on damage-oriented builds, or running Instructor and ignoring personal damage since their personal damage isn't really that high anyway. Because of that, it's limited lunar teams into specifically using Ino as the Hydra player since she has some synergy with Moonsign, short rotations, and some buffing utility locked away behind constellations. The problem though stems from the fact that Ino's application isn't all that great, her personal damage is literally nothing, and the buffing utility is locked behind these constellations, and she was only ever run on Flynn's banner, so most people who skipped Flynn's didn't even get copies of her, or if you're me and you pulled C3 Flynn's and you only got C4 Ino. Anyway, the point I'm making is that the accessibility of Ino might seem relevant, but the fact her utility before cons comes from running typically a buffing weapon or artifact set makes it so that she's super replaceable as soon as we get a competent competitor to her. Knowing this, we can finally discuss the reasons why Columbina is so strong inside of these teams. She takes every single weakness of Ino and completely removes them, from her Hydra application not being circle impact or energy reliant, to her buffing utility being in her base kit and her elemental burst, to her personal damage being quite genuinely really good in these teams and not being just a TOM bot or an artifact bot. All of these different things create an atmosphere for Columbina to quite literally destroy the competition, and is why these new teams are so strong compared to the previous best teams like Mavuika or Skirk. Now's a great time to talk about Nefer since she's the biggest winner from Columbina in my opinion. But before we go over Nefer, I just want to mention that I'm going to be leaving the Excel sheet for all of my calculations done in this video in the description. I've gone through a lot of testing phases with this video, and in particular, Nefer specifically. I've done a lot of rights and wrongs, and I've pretty much come to the conclusion of what I'm comfortable with. So if you do want to plug in the numbers for yourself and take a look and see if I made any mistakes, or if there's anything that you want to see for yourself, go ahead and take a look at the description. I will be posting the link to the Excel spreadsheet, and if there's any changes that need to be made inside of the pinned comment to update you and let you know so you have the most correct information soon as possible. Getting that out of the way, let's discuss the pre-6.3 team with the brand new 6.3 team. The left is my updated baseline of what I expect damage from Nefer to be pre-6.3 to be in a KQM investment level, having around 102k-ish DPS and being an overall solid option. And then on the right, I have the new team with Columbina and my results that I'm pretty confident in. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how running Lauma on 2-piece EM actually nets more damage for the team than running a dedicated set or letting Columbina run a sub-DPS set, since the majority of the damage in this team actually comes from Lauma's quills, putting a lot of the condensed damage into Nefer and Columbina respectively. Overall, like Flins, Columbina is an extraordinary buff since she's doing the same concept as before in this team and fixing the issues of Ino while being a direct upgrade in literally every avenue. Nefer's biggest problem in this team is the lack of a sustain option, so that's why I'm running double PA to attempt to help with the sustain. I don't expect anyone to have two different R5 prototype Ambers, but it was just used as a perfect scenario where the free-to-play team is optimized. Running Favonia's Codex on Nikita is like a tad bit of a damage bump since you can run a little bit more substats, like 2 less of ER on Columbina, but overall they're essentially the same, so don't feel worried if you don't have 2. It's going to be a little bit hard to live in this team, so I completely get it, but this is going to be a direct upgrade for her best option. Previously, I mentioned Kuki in this team slot, but after further testing, Kuki really only provides the healing, and the spread from her doesn't really feel like it has solid enough uptime to warrant using her, even if you lack a sustain in my opinion. But maybe my thoughts change once Columbina is released, and I can test a bit more when it comes to how many spreads Nefer will get. Overall though, this is the team I recommend. You can use Kuki if you want, and you do want a little bit of sustain option, but at that point you could probably just run something like Zhongli and get a little bit more value since you are not really going to get any spreads anyway. Alright, so, okay, let's talk about Zibai. I'll be making a dedicated video eventually, so I won't delve too much into Zibai, but Zibai teams work a bit differently from Flins and Nefer, since instead of Columbina being less contribution than 2 of the characters on the team, she's actually considered the sub-DPS in this team. Because of that, running Morningstar, like I said earlier, in an attempt to boost Columbina's personal damage, since she's acting as the sub-DPS, is the best choice here, unlike in the other teams. Another thing to note that is really bothering me is the constellation problem from Aluga and Goro. This team, if you have low copies of Iluka, is solid, but having C6 Iluka drastically changes things. I think this case is similar to Varese and Yansan, but a bit more egregious in my opinion. If you don't have C6 Iluka or C6 Girl to pair with your Zibai, don't expect her to reach the same levels of performance as Flins or Nefer. All that being said, the force slot in this team is pretty weak, and I'm not gonna lie, I expect Syndrome to be a slot in here, so future impact for a character at this point, just keep that in mind. Okay, gonna leave that as all for Zibai, but let's talk about someone a little bit more interesting with Columbina, Mavuika. So, with Mavuika, this team is actually fairly solid, all things considered. The main caveat is that there's typically no one here to help with the Night Soul generation, so the only Night Soul gen you're gonna have is from Mavuika's skill itself, and that can cause you to have problems in multiple rotation content. If you assume 200 Night Soul, however, this team is actually kind of strong, even compared to the other Mavuika teams. Definitely not an upgrade if you're doing sweaty Mavuika tech, but it's a solid competitor to the normal melt combo setups at 200 Night Soul. Not really recommended in my opinion, since the Night Soul generation problem will be a bit egregious in things like Stygian, but it's still cool nonetheless. Okay, now quickly I want to mention Skirk, since I think Columbina team with Skirk is actually really interesting. For Skirk specifically, the Columbina team doesn't typically perform how you'd expect. I found that running Columbina as essentially Farina 2 is a solid competitor in the way you want to play her in this team. Since you don't have any lunar reactions at all, you won't be generating any gravity stacks for her enhanced skill damage, meaning the damage from Columbina is strictly from her normal Hydro HP scaling damage. Because of that, if you play into it by running things like Golden Troop or TOM, you can actually make this a competitive Skirk option. Overall though, the biggest caveat on my opinion is the opportunity cost, since you have to run Columbina with Skirk, and that inherently doesn't make sense, since you can get semi-similar results with existing options, but it's a fun gimmick nonetheless. Okay, let's talk about Neuvillette, since I think this team is also pretty interesting. This team in reality is just a glorified Nogcry Hyper Bloom where Ineffa is dealing the most damage on a triple EM build to maximize the Hyper Blooms created. This team is realistically just another Neuvillette wheelchair core, but it'll probably be pretty fun doing a lot of lunar reactions. I don't have much to add on this team specifically since it's kind of changing the dynamic of the characters from dealing damage just to Hyper Bloom bots again, but overall it's still a solid option. I also did some calcs for Arlecchino and Nefer Columbina, and it actually seems really strong for Arlecchino. It's definitely a worthy competitor to her best teams at low investment. It probably tapers off against high investment Melt Arlecchino, but overall a really solid option. I'm excited I can use the levers of Commedia dell'Arte together at last, but overall, definitely something that you should use at lower investment. That pretty much does it for the characters I've calced. There's still a few teams to mention, but typically they fall into either the Columbina and Nefer core, or just not having a team slot, so I'll talk about a few of them. Firstly, the Electro Carries, Varese, Clarin, Raiden, and Cyno. Overall, these teams are very strong compared to previously, and have gotten major good improvements. Cyno being the biggest winner in my opinion of Nogcry, and Varese not really caring since it's a little bit worse of an alternative to her typical premium teams. Next, let's mention Hu Tao, since I think Hu Tao's double Hydro core with Ineffa will be pretty strong. This team I think requires in-game testing before I can say for certain since I'm not sure about the application, but I'm sure that it'll be an upgrade or at very least a semi-competitive side grade at low investment. For the Geo Carries, they really like the Lunar Crystallize being enabled by Columbina since it's another form of wheelchair that they can use. Overall, it's pretty strong, but I think it lacks a strong secondary unit to help with the core like Nefer and Columbina. Maybe Sandrone in the future will help with this issue, but who knows. Overall, a great option, but in my opinion feels a little too future impacty. For the Anemo Carries, I actually calced Wander for Jello as just like a napkin math thing, but it's not gonna be that great. It's gonna be alright just because the Nefer and Columbina are insanely strong, but other than that, it's not really all that. It'll probably still be an upgrade though because it falls into the concept of just being an Anemo driver who holds VV. I don't really think that's what people want to play since that's not really playing the character, that's just playing Sucrose but with less EM. Overall though, it'll probably be an upgrade, but not recommended for me in my opinion. For the Dendro teams other than Nefer, it's gonna be alright, but the problem is that a Nefer Columbina core kind of gets a little bit hurt by Dendro application, potentially taking away from some of the lunar charge uptime and making it a little bit more anti-synergistic than previously realized. But this is something I'm 100% unsure of, so I'll have to wait and see when it actually drops. And then for Lauma and Columbina, this will definitely be a very solid core for the Dendro characters. I'm still unsure how it's going to be for Kniech. I don't think it'll be that good considering Burgeon kind of just gimps Kniech. But for Alhaitham, it should most likely be an upgrade. Overall though, it's still on the fence. I'll have to wait for further testing. And with that, I'm pretty much done. Now I'm going to kind of go off script and just give you my final thoughts. I think Columbina is kind of crazy for pushing the damage barrier this far, especially for Nefer and Flins. Going over Mavuika while being a lot easier to pilot is kind of absurd. This kind of just shows the level of power creep that we're getting inside of Genshin. Hopefully it stays pretty minimal. It looks like in the coming patches, we're going to be stopping the lunar shill. We're going to be getting Varka and Alice, probably going into like a Hexen Circle, Hexen Right shill for Stygian. I'm still unsure how I feel about this. Columbina does look to be a really strong character. Her buffing capabilities aren't really that great, to be honest, but her sub DPS potential is what you're kind of pulling her for. And with that, I'm pretty much done. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. There was a few things I didn't talk about, like constellations, but if you go ahead and take a look in the Excel sheet down below, I will be listing it there. This video really drained me. Like, I spent like 2 weeks editing this video and trying to get everything ready. Thank you so much for watching at the very end. Make sure you subscribe once again. Go ahead and check the description as well for all the links in there. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.